it seems that there's a common theme, that number one, it's hard. Number two, people are trying different things and are moving directionally, but as lots of people have said, it's a journey. And I do think it's a bit of an unending quest to understand how your marketing spend actually turns into performance, because actually your marketing spend can turn into performance in a relatively short period of time, or in fact over much longer windows. And understanding that and understanding how to measure that is a constant challenge for people in marketing. I'm old enough to have started in marketing, direct to consumer, before the internet, and things were simple then. You sent out catalogs that had a code on it, and people phoned you up and you asked for that code, and life was good. But sadly, life has got significantly more complicated. So there are multiple channels and multiple touch points, many of which interlink and interweave. So you've got, press inserts, DM, door drops, that kind of stuff on the paper side. You've got an unending number of digital channels. Obviously, all of your social, and social can have multiple facets through social, through TikTok and Facebook and Insta and Pinterest. And then obviously search and social, search and affiliate marketing and referrals. Not forgetting that there's a big chunk of PR that I haven't spoken about at all. And then on top of that, lots of people around here are doing a bit of TV or radio, or maybe some out of home. And then, of course, on top of that, just to add in the extra complexities, you've got stores and wholesale. So it's a challenging place. And I've certainly worked in environments and I've walked into companies where people accept all of the measurements they get from all of their different channels, add them all up and just go, okay, we're going to take that number and divide it by 3, and that's what we think our marketing, and that's what we think our demand's going to be. And I've worked at companies that have more than £1 million turnover that do that, or used to do that. So I'm sorry, more than £100 million turnover that do that. So it's not a completely unheard of way of doing things, but it's definitely not the best way of doing things. Really, for me, it's going right back to your roots and understanding, to begin with, what do you currently have, and exactly what you currently have, how is that collected? And it's interesting talking to lots of people around the industry that people don't really understand either what they have, or they don't understand the intricacies of how some of it's collected. So you've probably got some data from website that probably comes through Google Analytics, because most people do nowadays. You've probably got a bit of matchback data kicking around if you do some mailings. You've probably got some coded data from where people give you codes. You've probably got, and those you can all relate to individual customers and individual orders. And then you've got the data that's a bit more challenging, where you can't link it to individual customers, which is Facebook's own reported data or other social channels' own reported data. But understanding each of those and understanding how the data is collected in each of those, for example, historically, Facebook may well have been on a 7-day view through 1-day click-through basis. Almost everyone is now being encouraged to change that measurement to a 1-day view, 1-day click, to align themselves properly with what's going to happen with the iOS changes. So understand what you've got, and then, really importantly, understand how you report internally your current sales. So again, lots of people don't actually understand, when they report internally on a hierarchical basis, and everyone reports, mostly people report one sale against one channel, which channel goes at the top and which one's winning and why. You don't have to critique it at that point. You just have to understand exactly what you're currently doing. Once you've got that, you then can start to play around with your different measurements you've got. So allow each of your measurements to take 100% of everything they've got, which means you've got a business that's 400% bigger than it really is. And then start meshing those against each other. So create a matrix of measurements so you can really understand where you've got really big overlaps that are beginning to all point in the same direction, and where you've got really big disparities which are beginning to point in different directions. So for example, if you've got a code that you've only ever used in generic paid search, and they've used that code and they've come through Google as generic paid search, and if 3 or 4 different things are telling you the same story, it's more likely that that story is beginning to point in that direction. If they're beginning to really separate, then that gives you an understanding as to where you might be looking first around those big crossover points. So for example, if half of all your brand paid search comes from people who also fall into a matchback report, that would tell you that there's probably a big Venn diagram crossover point there that you could start to investigate. And it's those big crossover points that you would probably be best off attacking first and beginning to understand how they lean up against each other. So when you want to understand how they lean up against each other, one of the easiest ways to start is setting up a series of incremental understandings. So run a series of holdout tests, incremental tests, whatever you want to call them, to understand what happens when you take away different bits of activity and how that impacts on other parts of the activity. So if I took away all direct mailing from a group of customers and I worked out that against a control group who I did send a DM, I lost 60% of demand, understand where you've lost that demand from. So I've lost all of the demand that was matched back to that DM, obviously, because I didn't send them the catalogue. But I've also lost 6% of all of my affiliate demand and 14% of all my search demand and 21% of all my social demand. And that starts to help you understand how each of those channels are interacting. It starts to give you clues and ideas around how those channels talk to each other and how they interrelate with each other. If you then take those two test groups and run them through your matrix measurements, where you've got all of the different ways of measuring, you can then start to really see, how have I lost, where have I lost, and where are those sales changes happened most apparently. You can then use that understanding to create the very beginnings of what you might call a fractional attribution model, because you can begin to say, I know that if I don't mail someone, I lose only 60% of their demand, which means 40%. When I take my cold mail and I get a matchback result, really only 60% of it I should trust, 40% of it I know is demand coming from elsewhere, and I know where else it's coming from. So therefore, I can attribute it across those channels according to the test results I've got. It starts to get relatively complex, because assuming you've got 5 different ways of measuring, and that's not entirely unusual to have 5, and you've got 25 channels, you can imagine that you can multiply those out and you multiply those out and multiply those out, and the numbers get quite big. But actually, they don't get any bigger than a sensible SQL database or a sensible analytical bit of kit can understand and use to, again, begin to create this fractional attributed model. Once you've begun to create that, you can then, and you can start in the simplest of ways. So you can start by just saying, it's that whole story of how do you eat an elephant, one bite at a time. Your measurement tomorrow just needs to be better than your measurement today. It doesn't need to be perfect. And so when Andrew talked, and lots of people talked about a journey, your journey can only start by being better tomorrow than today. And I've worked with a number of people in a number of places where people want to be perfect, and I get that. And I have a strong desire, being a man who is born of numbers, to want everything to stack up perfectly and to have a total innate understanding as to what's happening and why. But actually, understanding tomorrow better than I do today, that I can't take my match back as proof perfect of what that did. I can say that that is 60% of what's in match back, and the rest of it falls across the other channels as per my report. Now let's look at an incrementality test on something else. Let's turn off search, in particular geolocations. Let's only run inserts if we've got inserts. Let's remove Granada from all your inserts, or TV, or there are ways of running incrementality tests on almost all media. I've yet to discover how to do it in any way, shape or form on PR, which is why I will at some point, and that's how I'm going to buy my yacht. But on almost all other media, you can work out how to suppress and then learn by running through the matrix measurement time after time after time, and improving the model outputs, improving the numbers you're reporting on, one step at a time, one step at a time, one step at a time. It does become challenging in some areas. So I'll take Facebook because it's a prime example. A lot of you probably spend a reasonable chunk of money in Facebook. Facebook has its own internal holdout engine, and as a starting point, that's a whole lot better than trusting Facebook's numbers entirely or trusting Google's numbers entirely. We'll all know, because we'll all have run it. Facebook says you get 100 orders. Google says you get 5 orders from Facebook. The answer is somewhere in the middle, and we're trying to work out what that is. So start by running Facebook's own incrementality testing. On top of that, you can have custom audiences in Facebook. So create a custom audience, create the data you want from a custom audience, cut half of it, load half of it, don't load half of it, and you can run your own external incrementality test on Facebook that way. So you can test Facebook's own internal uplift model against an external one. I've done this 5, 6, 7 times so far, and actually Facebook's own internal attribution model is surprisingly robust, and unlike Facebook, doesn't try and give absolutely everything to Facebook. It is a surprisingly robust model as far as I've used it so far. You can obviously, it gets a little bit challenging when you then start looking at TV, for example, and Andrew mentioned econometric models. Now, you can spend fortunes on econometric models, and I've done that, and I've used them, and they are really quite powerful and really quite useful. Again, nothing's 100%, but if we're talking of where we are now being about 20%, econometric modeling would get you to about 90. But it is furiously expensive, and I think you can get a huge step of the way by using the data you have and the data you own and the media you're currently using to push a step further and a step further and a step further.